Hello and welcome to History Respawned. I'm your host, John Harney. Today we're looking at The Division 2, an online co-op shooter heavily predicated on gear and equipment. Loot, as video game fans call it, from video game development behemoth Ubisoft. The game is a successor, naturally enough, to 2016's The Division, and the games share a central premise. The United States has succumbed to an apocalyptic plague, and the very sinews of the state itself are at serious risk of snapping. What is there to stand in front of this existential threat? Well, the eponymous Division, of course, and its brave agents, of which you are now one. The first game was set in a wintry New York and received much attention, both good and bad. We live in an age of persistently online co-op shooters, and that brings with it significant technical obligations on the side of the developers. Much of the criticism levelled at the first game focused on such issues, but its textual substance did not go unnoticed either. The Division's take on New York was supremely melancholic. Opening credits suffused with the plaintive sounds of loved ones, including children, succumbing to what seemed a vicious flu, but quickly became apparent as a lethal pandemic. Your player character walked snowy streets and fired off shots in relative isolation. The Division was an interesting game in the extent to which you could make one feel lonely even when playing with other people. The fictional Division itself, as a concept, also reeks of authoritarianism for some. As an agent, you more or less have carte blanche to travel the city murdering at will, though both games carefully couch such violence in structures of perceived justice and redemption for the weak and previously unprotected. The first game, set in New York, raised hackles for commentators who felt the game perhaps gave too little attention to, if not trod all over, the city's history as the target of the most notorious and large-scale terrorist attack on American soil. Indeed, reviews of the second game, now set in the American capital Washington, D.C., continue this theme. Eurogamer's Johnny Chiodini is by no means an outlier when he describes the game as, quote, great and repugnant. The game is great, by the way. The feedback loop of gain quest, shoot bad guys, collect loot, turn in quest, repeat is tight and fun. Progression through the game is expeditious without feeling cheap, and the endgame manages to more or less resuscitate all that is fun about the game while adding more. And all of this is more fun when you play with others, whether friend or stranger, though it's a particular blast with friends. Still, the premise of the game is on the edge, either of tastefulness or vulgarity. It's often hard to say. Your agent is the one with all the agency, a pivot of transformative justice in a world gone wrong. So far, so video game. But Division 2 does bring odd tones with it. One mission relatively early in the game involves rescuing the president, stranded until you release him, at which time he promptly picks up a submachine gun and starts wielding it around like something from misguided teen fantasies. An Air Force One character re-envisioned as more of a supremely empowered bro. In fact, the bro vibes permeate the game, which when added to the game's attitude to violence, not just as a result of gameplay, but as some kind of inherent source of redemption in and of itself, creates strange moments. Still, don't get me wrong, the game is not some kind of egregious crime against good taste, and if anything is a fascinating tonal mishmash. Settlements, one of the very best concepts introduced for this sequel, give you a chance to give a face to the redemption offered by Division agents' capacity for violence, slowly converting burnt-out buildings sheltering fearful refugees into, as Brock Paper Shotgun's Brendan Caldwell describes, the farmer's market down the posh end of town. So yes, the game deals in politics, despite Ubisoft's rather unconvincing arguments that it does no such thing. So why am I talking about politics quite so much? Am I trying to make history political? I'm probably a few thousand years late on that particular score. But no, I'm not terribly interested in a deeper conversation about the Division 2's politics beyond the most striking aspect of this tonally complex, if not a bit muddled, but very fun online shooter. Its location. In addition to drawing attention for its politics, the Division series, as we can comfortably now say 2 games in, gets a lot of attention for its fidelity in recreating real-world environments. First New York, and now Washington, D.C. Kotaku compared the first game's version of New York to Google Maps' rendition of that city. But the Division 2 has attracted a slightly different tone in coverage, with USA Today featuring the headline, Tom Clancy's The Division 2 makes nation's capital a battle zone. Not an outlier by any means, if a very USA Today of them. Verisimilitude lies at the centre of the game's claimed authenticity, with FEMA specialists and the US Coast Guard being consulted as to how the capital might react to a disaster requiring the evacuation of as much of the local population as possible. If the Division 2 creates an alternate reality, or perhaps a developing alternate history, it theoretically does so built on the foundations of authenticity. Authenticity and accuracy are tricky words, of course, and much of DC's presence in the game goes beyond the admittedly impressive recreation of tight downtown streets intersecting with the city's famous monuments. The game uses its location in fascinating ways and rarely subtly. Washington, D.C. itself, of course, was a city built for purpose, intentionally created as a seat of power away from the potential corruptive influences of existing power bases further up the eastern seaboard, founded almost immediately in the wake of the American Revolution, brought into existence by the Residence Act of 1790, and named after the first President of the United States, George Washington. The Capitol is replete with architectural statements, from the Capitol building itself to the White House, from the Lincoln Memorial with its enthroned enfranchiser to the Washington monuments reach to the sky. The game takes full advantage of this. The gameplay itself focuses on staying in cover while surviving tight shootouts in urban environments, where a good flanking movement will win the day. Much of the Division 2's gameplay, especially early on, does an incredible job of creating this sense of urban warfare, much like its predecessor. Soon, however, you break out into the open spaces, and famous landmarks come dramatically into view. The game uses the drama of these discoveries extremely well. It opens with your character fighting his way to the White House, now the base of operations for the Division's attempts to reclaim the Capitol. From there, you find yourself shooting your way around the Washington Monument and gaining access to the basement beneath, flanking your way up the steps towards the famous Lincoln statue. Some of my favourite moments come when one of these landmarks hone into view while you're doing something more or less unrelated. I frequently feel, when I'm playing the Division 2, that I'm in the shadow of power previously projected, before everything fell apart. This makes the Division 2 feel, to me at least, like it's having more direct conversations with the history it so clearly invokes. Indeed, by basing the game in DC, the developers made a more obvious and more blatant interaction with historical legacies inevitable. Nothing exists outside of our conversations with history, but the landmarks of the American Capitol were built with a clear ambition of foregrounding and shaping those conversations. Recreating DC effectively does digitize this process, carrying over the logic of an imposing memorial from the real space into the virtual. And everything is ruined. The entire point of the game is, of course, a ruined Capitol, a seat of power torn down. For me, though, the greatest example of the game's symbolism lies in the reflecting pool that connects Lincoln's memorial to Washington's monument. Here, the game has rendered the intentional glory and supremacy of the state to squalor. Done so as part of a broader design approach, yes, its transgression disguised by the language of those who see this as just a video game. But here is where the game's intersections of somewhat clumsy narrative deliberation over the fate of a people after the collapse of the state they constructed, and the visual symbolism of a seat of power ruined, are the most effective. The Division 2, in its supposed authenticity in recreating a dystopian Washington, D.C., conceivable only months from now, in many ways brings us a more fully realised vision of history ended than the post-nuclear urban shells of the Fallout games or the amorality of social collapse in The Walking Dead. History itself, of course, cannot end, but specific constructed points of view on history and its contributions to power end all the time. The Division 2, though perhaps a little too fond of a temporarily fascistic recourse to redeeming society, is suffused with the recent collapse of power, a power constructed and based in history. Lincoln looks over a ruined pool. Washington's monument towers over gunfights of petty looters and criminals, a world away from high-minded concepts of civic virtue supposedly personified in George Washington himself. The White House lies in tatters, now functioning as a place to go and get upgrades for your weapons, host to NPCs who will give you activities to complete, show you how to craft a pair of gloves or cut your hair. It's not all subtextual. The city's museums play a prominent part in the game's quest structure. The Air and Space Museum plays host to one of my favourite missions. Within those spaces, you take cover behind some of the country's greatest technological achievements and stand before the nation's relics. It hasn't occurred to anyone to take the Star-Spangled Banner from the National Museum of American History, for example, though some have found time to leave rather cynical graffiti. All of this locates the United States in a historical place in a manner that has consumed so many for over a century now. The end of World War II quickly gave way to a Cold War defined by American power and its opponents. 9/11 brought trauma, in the immediate human sense, of course, but also in broader conceptions of American power. Conversations on American imperialism in academia and in public discourse abound. This debate is underpinned by the evolution of the United States from a product of the New World to counter the Old, from a victory for all the best impulses of the Enlightenment and its support for democracy and human rights, to something else. At some point, the United States really is just another country, if not just another empire. An empire's fall.
Let me guess, we're pulling short rations again.
Thank you for watching. History Respawned is only possible because of the support of our patrons, and I want to say a special thank you to all of them. If you are interested in supporting us, please consider visiting patreon.com/historyrespawned. You can also find us at www.historyrespawned.com, which also features the History Respawned podcast. Thank you, and see you next time.